Should we start a golden age for new nations? Or basically end all war forever and politics and war? It's an interesting question, because almost every new player asks it at some point. Usually when they're getting rolled in an alliance war or a global war, or even by a random new player that's raiding them. So, in short, why do we have wars in PNW? And can we ever stop them? Who has tried, who has failed? So why do we have wars? Well, on a nation level, you attack other nations for resources or because you don't like them. Perhaps they're a communist and you don't like communists. Perhaps they like the color green and you like the color blue. It can be anything. Or they have like 50,000 bauxite and it would be a crime not to raid them for it. Or they have like 3,000 infrastructure at City 2. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to raid someone. Usually stupidity is a good one. Stupidity and richness. Or wealth. That's for the nation level though. And that's easily explained. And you can try and stop that if you think that all war is bad, and that's fine. You can try and do that. You'll never succeed, but you can try because you're fighting human nature. And you're fighting a game that has war as a fundamental mechanic. But on the other level, on the alliance level, it does grow more complicated because, as you probably noticed, alliance wars are kind of decided in the first 36 hours. As soon as your units are gone, it's game over. They won. Well done. Applause. The war should end. But it doesn't. It usually carries on for a month, or in some cases, a year, which is nuts. It seems unnecessary. Both cruelty and stupidity on their part. Yes and no. The reason it lasts for a month is a mix of economic concerns, political concerns, and I would say human concerns. For the economic ones, the big alliances basically want to maintain their relative power, right? They want to have the City 30s, they want their rivals to have the City 20s. So when they attack their rival, they want to destroy all their expensive infrastructure. And this isn't instantaneous. You can't do it in a round or two. You does tend to take at least 3 to 4 rounds, which means 2 to 3 weeks. And then the last week is spent on negotiations or stupidity. So I guess it is a bit inflated, but yeah, it takes a while to destroy their expensive infrastructure. The defender, the people that are losing, also want to inflict economic damage on the winner, right? They want them to pay a price for attacking them. Otherwise, the winner will just do it as often as possible because they know they'll win, so they might as well repeat the action. So they want them to pay a price so they don't repeat it as quickly. That's why you also have non-aggression pacts. So the loser tries to get a non-aggression pact so they can guarantee they'll have 6 months to prepare and try to win again. Yeah, so that's the motivation for the attacker and the defender to sort of drag out those wars. The human motivation is that usually wars are started for a reason, a casus belli, a justification for war. Perhaps one of the alliances spied on the other. In that event, the alliance that was spied on will want that to stop. So they'll be fighting for as long as possible until the opponent concedes and says, I won't do that again. And it could be anything. So they're fighting and trying to whittle down their resistance or their patience. So those are two concerns. And then the other concern I would say is more sort of political in that you basically want people to sort of have a tolerance or a strength of character that they won't give up immediately and that they will stand with the alliance in tough times. So wars are very good for building sort of camaraderie and member loyalty and for teaching the game. It's like the school of hard knocks in wars, whereas you can't really train that so much in peacetime. So wars are good tests of their members' mettle. Most alliances don't even really consider members like full members until they at least go through a war or two. And then they can fully invest in them. Because there will always be those alliances which are willing to fight really long wars. And if you're going up against them with newbies or people that don't fight as much, you're going to lose. Whereas if you have people that are a bit tested, then you're more confident you're able to compete. With this war in particular, because it is actually a bit different, there are some other motivations for keeping it going longer. So the war mechanics recently changed, so up-declare range was increased from 175% of your nation's score to 250%. And this means that the losers can now nuke the richest nations in the enemy coalition, which they couldn't do before. Before, those richest nations would sort of stay out of range, make tons of money, rebuild all the smaller people, in some cases, or in other cases, hoard it all for themselves and let the rest burn. But yeah, now you can nuke those rich nations. So the defending coalition has a lot of incentives for keeping the war going and making sure that the enemy pays not just a price for fighting the war, but the harshest price that any alliance has paid before. With that in mind, the war will almost inevitably come to a conclusion within a month, or at most, I would say 2, because the big alliance on the losing side, we'll say Singularity, they want to remain a top 3 alliance. So they have to end the war within a month or 2 so that they can catch up to the others economically. Right? If they're at war for like 6 months and all their rivals are at peace, they will not be a top 3 alliance by the end of it. They will be a top 10 alliance. And if they do it again, they'll be top 20. The game is very harsh. And in years past, when there were just 2 coalitions, like the game was bipolar, you could see much longer wars, but when it's multipolar, the wars get a lot shorter because people are trying to guarantee as much peacetime as possible. As for why there's permanent nuclear radiation, that is also in part because of this multipolarity. It's because almost constantly, 24/7, there will be at least 2 alliances at war. And these alliances will fight for a month, they'll peace, and then another 2 alliances will fight for a month and then peace. And that whole time, people will be dropping nukes, so no food will be produced, raising food prices, messing with the economy. It's not a terrible thing. In fact, we could even use a few more wars because so much food was produced over the past few years that even if there was no food produced for the next 5 years, we would still have enough to keep the game totally sustained. The pricing of food is actually relatively low, all things considered. Oh, but what people have actually tried to end a war and how successful have they been? So there were a few individual players. One that comes to mind is Jonas, who tried to end war by convincing other people to do it. It didn't work because all the big alliances sort of know that they know why wars are fought, they know how wars are fought, they know that they're not going to convince anyone else, regardless of their individual opinions. And they all want to be strong alliances at the end of the day. So you're never going to convince the top alliances. You might convince a majority of the lower tier, which has happened a few times in the past. Primarily because big alliances don't want their protectorates fighting, they want them growing as much as possible or raiding inactives. So protectorates are discouraged from fighting each other. And other small alliances in the tier, well, they want to be pacifists as well because they want to grow, but also because they're new. So you can have this pacifism that goes through the lower tier, and lots of micros like to sign treaties. So everyone's connected, and it's really hard to do any war whatsoever. And then in the super high tier, when there's a bunch of whales, often that can become pacified too, because there'll be one Leviathan that's way more powerful than everyone else, and so they don't really get messed with. But in the mid tier, that's sort of the meat grinder. That's where everyone's fighting, and the meat grinder will even drag in some of the high tier. So the only truly safe place in the game, I would say, is the lower tier, but only some of the time. The lower tier is plagued by, I would say, the wolves. You have the wolves and you have the herd. The herd of the protectorates and the small alliances, the pacifists, and then the wolves that just sort of come in and consume them all and gather enough power for themselves to become mid-tier alliances. There are lots of examples of very successful wolf alliances, but I'll leave that for another day. In terms of big alliances and people that have actually made a more serious attempt to pacify the game, I would consider the Green Protection Agency, GPA, and to some extent TFP and other neutral alliances. So with GPA, what they did is they said, hey, none of us want to fight wars, we'll never fight aggressive wars. Even defensive wars they were kind of against. And so they rapidly outgrew pretty much everyone else, because they would sit out all the big wars, and the other big alliances were so focused on dealing with the real threats and not GPA. They were kept busy for a few years, and GPA became very, very powerful. And until all the other smaller alliances were wiped out, and the competition somewhat ended, the big alliances eventually turned to GPA, realized how rich they were, realized they were no threat whatsoever, and tore them to pieces. And in their wake, you had alliances like Pantheon and like the Commonwealth and a few others. And these were more, I would consider, they weren't neutral alliances, but they were close. Some other neutral alliances, basically, they pop up, they don't have any allies, they chill for a bit, they inevitably get raided out of existence because they can't keep up with the other big alliances economically, and because the big alliances will just raid them for free money because there are no consequences for attacking them. So these other smaller alliances like the Commonwealth, like Pantheon, they grew very quickly like GPA because they were fundamentally the same. They avoided wars, but they had strong allies, or they were sort of hid next to bigger allies. And sometimes they'd even ally raiding groups because they knew that these raiding groups were so feared that fear would sort of spread over them. Right? They would be under the security umbrella. It didn't really work at the end of the day because ultimately they did have to fight sometimes, and they never performed well because in their culture, in their heart of hearts, they didn't want to fight, and they were recruiting people that were avoiding wars. People would join the Commonwealth, they would join Pantheon because they didn't want to fight in global wars, and when they accepted those war dodges, they accepted a person that would just abandon them at the slightest sign of trouble. So if you're in a big alliance and you're stuck fighting a war that you really don't want to fight, or you're in a protectorate that's been dragged into one, the best advice which most people will give you is to fight it out for that month, or for at least 3 weeks or whatever, and then move on. So that way, you're not a war dodger, you are a loyal member. There can be no disparagement of you. And you can look for which alliances are relatively safe. And those tend to be the biggest alliances, because they will have guaranteed peace for 3 to 6 months of the year, and then 1 month of war. So your ratio of peace to war is 6-1. That is a fantastic deal. Micros, they might have 12-1. Or they might have 1-1. It's hard to tell. There's more risk involved. And then for mid-tier alliances, it's like 3-1. Unless they're allied to, again, a big alliance, in which case it's the same as theirs, which would be 6-1. A lot of the time, if you go over 6-1, then, as I said, the membership will sort of become less resilient. And then the alliance will have huge shocks when they lose global wars, or even just big alliance wars. Those shocks can lose money, they can result in leadership changes, they can result in all sorts of negative effects, which are potentially more dangerous to the individual player than just being in a big alliance where you routinely lose or win every 6 months. Like, you're flipping a coin every 6 months, and the result is fine either way. It's a bit unfortunate if you lose, right? You lose a couple weeks' growth, but that's it. Whereas if you go longer than 6 months, you could lose all the money you saved in that alliance. You could lose that alliance. You could be hit by all sorts of stigma created by the chaos of a collapsing alliance. So yeah, that's in short why there are global wars. If there are other reasons which I'm leaving out, leave them in the description. Hopefully this is somewhat comprehensive.